Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at Abacode. My name is Brian Graff. I'm SVP of Business Development here at Abacode. I'm joined by Robert Lubin, who is our Director of our Security Operations Center. And this presentation is the compliance-driven SOC. So thanks for joining. The goal of this webinar is to show you first what a standard Security Operations Center is, what its makeup is, what its goals are. Right now in the news, I'm sure all of you are aware, ransomware attacks are skyrocketing, breaches are skyrocketing, and the SOC is really a business's core. It's their security operations center, so it's the core of responding to these incidents, detecting these incidents, and keeping them from becoming catastrophic incidents. So that is traditionally what a SOC has been there for in organizations. The goal of this presentation is to show you how you can go further and use the SOC to help drive compliance with your security standards. They're intertwined with each other, and to formalize that process can really help you help improve your security incident response process and help you maintain compliance. So the goals for today are, we're going to describe the function of the SOC, review how standard security compliance is met when you have a security control, when you're trying to comply with a security standard. What does an auditor look for in terms of audit evidence? How do you know you're compliant? And then describe how the SOC processes and a SIEM can be configured to help you maintain and monitor that compliance. So I'll throw it over to Robert.
Hey everybody, thanks Brian. So what is a SOC, right? Everybody knows it's Security Operations Center. That could be either in-house or a third party, such as Abacode. So the SOC's basically responsible for the configuration of security mechanisms, specifically monitoring mechanisms, and for monitoring the network for incidents and attacks. So what do we mean by that? Well, we're going to be heavily involved in the deployment and the configuration, right? So we're aggregating logs throughout your organization of all different log source types, right? So that's going to be everything from network devices such as firewalls, switches, routers, access points, your Windows and Linux servers, your workstations, endpoint protection or EDR. Any workload you have in the cloud, anything SaaS such as 365, G Suite. We're pulling all those different log sources into one central repository, and then those logs are going to be parsed and then run through alarm correlation rules, right? So essentially, these rules are looking to detect suspicious behavior, anomalous behavior, potentially malicious behavior. One thing also I would note as part of the configuration is just because you're connecting log sources doesn't necessarily mean you're pushing all the correct logs to the SIEM, right? So for instance, from your Windows environment, right? It's not only are we pulling those logs, but we're going to validate that the correct GPO audit policy logging settings are in place, right? Additionally, with your network devices, for instance, we're also going to validate that the syslog logging levels are appropriate so that we're getting the types of logs that we need to parse and then run through those alarm correlation rules. Additionally, we're also configuring something you may call a silent log source error, or if a host stops reporting logs, right? Just because everything's working properly today and all log sources are reported as expected doesn't mean that they're going to be working properly tomorrow. So we'll also configure rules based on essentially system health. Are we getting logs from everywhere that we need to get logs from? All right, so once everything's set and we're in our day-to-day, the SOC team is working 24/7 reviewing these alerts as they're generated by the SIEM or potentially other systems such as like an EDR platform. And we are going to analyze, triage those alerts in order to escalate potential threats to the organization, right? A key component that we're doing is we're really triaging out a lot of those false positives that may occur, so that the notifications that we're sending to the organization are relevant and require some sort of action. All right. We're actively monitoring external threat and news sources to build rules to detect newly identified threats. Right. The content development, if you will, those rules, they constantly have to adapt as the malicious actors adapt, right? As they make changes to their tactics, techniques, and procedures, we need to then pivot in our alarm correlation rules in order to detect those new tactics. All right, go to the next slide, please. All right, so why are SOCs important for compliance? Well, most security standards have requirements for log aggregation and review. That's really the and continuous monitoring. That's kind of the core of what a SOC's doing, along with the SIEM platform. Risk identification. That we could. There's certainly rules in place to identify risks, such as, just as an example, potentially if you have open ports and services exposed to the internet that probably shouldn't be, that's certainly something that we can detect with the alarm correlation rules. Additionally, incident response plan, including detect, analyze, contain, right? So that really is the core of what the SOC is doing for the organization, right? And a formal SOC established by a GRC committee would comply with all those things we mentioned above, all right? Pass it back to you, Brian.
Yep. So Robert raises some good points. Just having a SOC, just having a SIEM doesn't mean you're secure or compliant. It is a system that needs constant maintenance and monitoring. You have your own correlation rules that are provided by your threat feeds, provided by the SIEM itself, but you also have to be looking at external news sources. You have to be seeing what's out there, because you may not know a type of attack is occurring until you see it on the news or you see it happen to somebody else. That's what, 0-day vulnerabilities occur all the time. So you have to be vigilant, and you have to have personnel that are constantly creating rules, making sure that when new assets are onboarded, that those logs are being ingested into the SOC. When there are major changes to an organization, that the SOC is a part of that. So just having security personnel and having the technology in place isn't enough from either security or compliance perspective. So when we say a formal SOC that is established by a GRC committee, what we mean is that the executive management of a business got together and understood that there are security risks to this organization. What do we do to put our resources in the most impactful way to mitigate those risks? And through that risk assessment process, selected the SIEM that they would be using, assign the personnel, assigned a security officer that has responsibility for overall security of the organization. That's a specific requirement for a lot of the compliance standards that many organizations are under, that are required to comply with. So ISO 27001, HIPAA, High Trust, FedRAMP, CMMC starts with making a person or a department responsible for security, because as we all know, if no one's assigned responsibility or authority to do something, it's not going to get done. The SOC also needs security policies. They have to be guided and known about they have to know about the requirements of their duties in terms of building rules, monitoring, and then just overall general security awareness. A SOC is going to be a target for malware and hackers, because if you can get to the SIEM, if you can shut down the SIEM, then you can do whatever you want. So security analysts have to be aware of the overall security of the organization and their own security credentials, making sure that they're not being phished, making sure that they understand the secure access practices for accessing the SIEM and things like that. So they have to be guided by security policies. Security analysts also are required for many standards, they're required to complete role-based security training. So just the general security awareness training of don't share your password with someone, make sure you read before you click on a link in an email, don't send your credentials to anybody. That's not enough for a security analyst for a lot of these standards. So for ISO 27001, HITRUST, FedRAMP, CMMC, they call out specific role-based training for security personnel. Security analysts also are going to be obviously the first line of defense in terms of the incident response process. So they need to be trained in how they respond to incidents. What type of incidents are you looking for? If they get an alert, is this a minor thing that we monitor, or is this an all hands, we need to get everyone on the phone right now and respond to this incident? In order for you to understand that, you have to have policies in place and you have to be trained. And there has to be an actual plan in place and tested annually. A lot of these policies are written, plans are written, but the analysts never actually are involved in these plans. So if they are not reading the plans, if they're not responsible for them, and they're not tested at least annually, then that plan is just sitting in a SharePoint folder somewhere. And when you need it, you don't know if it's going to operate effectively. Almost all security standards require that security logs are aggregated and stored in an unalterable format. If you have a SIEM, then you're complying with that. Usually most SIEMs are automatically storing logs in an unalterable format. However, that still does require that the SIEM is actually getting the logs from all the relevant devices. So again, just having the SIEM turned on doesn't mean you're complying with that, because if you're not getting those logs from all of the relevant devices, they're just sitting on that local device and probably aren't being retained according to your company's policies. And then finally, the alerts are documented in a ticketing system and tracked through to resolution. So just having alerts isn't enough. What did you do with the alert? You know, how did you follow the policy? Did you follow the escalation process? Did you go from investigation to analysis to containment to eradication? That all has to be documented in the ticketing system. So just detecting the security event on its own doesn't really help you at all if there's not a detailed response process. So again, just to comply with security standards, a SOC needs policies, procedures, and it needs a formal process around it to make sure it's doing everything it needs to do to function properly. So when most people think about SOC and they think about compliance, they think about certain areas of compliance. And what we have on the screen here, these are the control families for CMMC. And traditionally, when an auditor comes in to assess a security program, and you have a SIEM in place and you have Security Operations Center that deals with the following control families: audit and accountability. Are you logging everything? Are you aware of what your employees are doing? Are you monitoring activity in your organization? The SIEM logs and the incident response process will help comply with those controls. Obviously, incident response, if you don't know an incident is occurring, you can't respond to it. If you don't have a detailed response process, you're not going to comply with those controls. Situational awareness, just understanding your security posture, it's monitoring, being aware of threats, and systems and communications protection. Obviously, we need to detect an incident, and if there's a ransomware or it's a breach, lock it down, make sure it doesn't affect the company catastrophically. So all of these control families are traditionally when an auditor goes into an organization and they're pulling information from the SIEM, they're interviewing security personnel, they are usually focused on these four types of controls. And the goal of this presentation is to show you that really the SIEM is a linchpin for almost all of your control families. And we'll go further into that in the following slides. But first, before we get to that, just to comply with the above controls to make sure that you have adequate incident response, that you have adequate audit and accountability, you're aware of your situational awareness, and you're able to protect your systems. If an auditor is coming in and auditing your security program, they're going to ask for these audit artifacts. They're going to ask for a logging and monitoring policy. So how is your organization setting up these systems, your servers, your firewalls, all of your devices to audit these events so that the SIEM can collect those events? Incident response policy, I mean, we've gone over that. How do you detect an incident? What type of incident is it? Is it ransomware? Is it a physical attack? Is it phishing? Is it a breach? Is it just a lockdown, or is there data being stolen? Is it still ongoing, or did it already occur? All of these determine how you're supposed to react. If you don't have those written down beforehand, and then a major incident occurs, then that is not a good time to be learning on the fly how to respond to these incidents. A listing of employees and titles. So this is required for a couple of reasons. First, we want to make sure the security personnel and everyone that has access to a SIEM or any sort of sensitive systems has a job function that requires that. So especially for smaller organizations, we may go in and find that personnel that really have no business being, having administrator access or having access to security functions or something like that, really don't have any job function to do that. So making sure that everyone, least privilege is applied, and everyone that has access to the SIEM, has access to these security mechanisms, is supposed to have access to it. Job descriptions. So along with security policies, the personnel that you onboard have to be aware of their specific roles with security and their general overall security awareness responsibilities. So when you onboard someone, you should have them acknowledge that they've received all your security policies and they've adhered to them. They should also be signing a job description so that they're aware from day one security is their responsibility, and they are supposed to be responding to incident response or to incidents and threats. So once the auditor has reviewed the policies, they've done interviews, they are comfortable that you have a process in place and you have competent personnel that are running your security operations center, then they're actually going to go into the network and make sure that your network devices are configured to log security events. So things like logons, invalid logins, changing configurations for specific security functions. Robert mentioned earlier, if you go in and turn logging off for a specific device, that's a pretty good indication that someone's about to do something really bad and they don't want you to see it. So you want to make sure that is definitely sending an alert to the SIEM. Prior to logs turning off, we're aware that's happening. So the auditor will look at all those examples and say, okay, the devices are now, we know that those devices are logging security events. How are your personnel made aware of those events? Without a SIEM, that's pretty much impossible. You're going to have to go into these device logs or go into some sort of aggregator and manually correlate. Okay, this event happened here at 12 p.m. Okay, well, this person logged into this VPN concentrator or onto this server 30 minutes before. I mean, to do it manually is pretty much impossible. So they want to make sure that you have some sort of automated mechanism that is sending alerts to your administrators, your security personnel. There's some sort of configuration that is sending emails or alerts to somebody. And then they want to see example logs. They want to see them on the network devices if you don't have a SIEM, but they're going to want to see them inside the SIEM if you have one, and making sure that they are collecting the events that are listed in your logging and monitoring policy and to the level that you say that they are. There are standard attributes that you need to log for each type of event. I mean, the date and time, any associated user accounts, any objects that were changed, things like that. And it's different for different types of events, but you have to make sure that those are configured correctly, and then the auditor will go in and look at the logs and make sure that they were configured correctly and it's generating the correct logs. And then finally, they'll look at the SIEM, they'll look at alerts, they'll look at evidence of incident investigation and resolution. So let's say you have a low-level alert that was generated, on Monday. Let's say you have a certain amount of time to review that. So not only does the alert need to be generated, but then we need to see that response to that alert. We need to see it in a ticket. I'm trying to think of another way to document incident response, but without a ticketing system, it's pretty much impossible. So you want to make sure that not only are your security personnel, they understand how to respond to incidents, but they understand how to document their response, because they may be the smartest tech analysts in the world, but they may not be there the next day. So if someone else needs to further investigate an incident, or a similar incident occurs, that documentation needs to be there, and it needs to be complete all the way through resolution, so that we can apply the lessons learned and maybe configure the SIEM to detect that alert better next time. Maybe we tweak our response process, but we need to be able to include what we learned from that incident response process in the future to bolster our security posture. So now that we know traditionally what a SOC does, what's required from a SOC for compliance, and how it affects your compliance posture, I wanted to show you really if you configure your SIEM correctly and you're collecting evidence like you should be, your SIEM can help you maintain compliance with controls in almost every control family. I left out physical protection, personnel security, and media protection, but honestly, you can use a SIEM for any of those as well. So for physical protection, you could have your badge access system send alerts when it detects someone trying to jar open a door, or trying to badge more than 5 times with an invalid badge access system. That should be alerted to your SOC team, because that could be evidence of someone trying to break in, or someone doing something they're not supposed to be doing. Personnel security, you can have any system that generates logs forward the log to the SIEM. The SIEM can aggregate and process almost any IT system log. There are a few caveats, but it doesn't have to be an IT system. It can be an OT system. It can be a physical security system. It can be an HR system. If it's generating events, we can generate alerts on those events. So for access control, let's say that you have controls that say that terminated employees must have their access removed upon termination. You can configure, if you have an HR system that can generate logs, you can configure your HR system to send an event whenever somebody is terminated, and make sure that that's a part of your termination process. The SOC team now knows that person should not be accessing anything after that date. So it's just making sure that everyone's aware of the changes being made to your organization, the personnel that should and should not have access. It goes far beyond just IT. It's anything that can create a log, even media protection. So that deals with physical media that can store sensitive data. So USB drives, flash drives, removable disk drives. We don't use them as much anymore, because most people are using backups and using cloud storage, and thumb drives really aren't used as much anymore. But for media protection, again, just like any other system, you can configure your GPO to just not allow USB drives, or if you do need them to be used, you can configure GPO to alert the SIEM whenever a USB drive is used, so that if someone uses it maliciously, you can check and figure out when that occurred and who did it. So again, any one of these controls and control families can have evidence generated by the SIEM and collected by the SIEM, so that when your auditor comes on site, you are in a much better position in trying to evidence that these controls are in place. So I keep talking about compliance and evidence. To be compliant, you need to be able to prove what you're doing. You need to be able to prove you're doing what you're saying you're doing. So for a control to be compliant, it must be designed appropriately to fulfill the control requirement, and it must operate effectively over time. So the control design is covered by security policies, by interviews, it could be by job descriptions. It's anything that's showing that we have taken the time to take this control requirement and apply a technology or a process to it to fulfill that requirement. And there are 4 types of evidence that you can give to show that a control is in place and operating effectively. There are interviews, policy or procedure, walkthrough or observation, and sample evidence. Obviously, sample evidence is the strongest evidence that a control is in place. There are some controls that there's not going to be sample evidence, but they're very few in number. There are things like making sure that your guests, you have a staffed. If you have a company, if you have an entrance to your company that is open to the public, that you have somebody like a receptionist or a security or somebody that is taking visitor information before just letting them walk into the organization. But again, those are very, very rare. Almost every control should be able to have some kind of sample evidence, and the SIEM and your SOC team can be your source of data for almost all of that sample evidence. And sample evidence is required for effectiveness for SOC 2 Type 2, FedRAMP, High Trust, and CMMC. There's also example evidence, meaning instead of me, so sample evidence is if you have a daily control, meaning let's say every day or let's say every week your change management team meets to review the upcoming releases into your environment. Well, you would take a sample of weeks and say, give me those meeting minutes or give me evidence that occurred. For ad hoc events like responding to security incidents, onboarding and offboarding, all of that, there's no population to select. It's ad hoc. So the only real way to show that evidence, that control is in place, is to be able to log that event occurred and be able to go back throughout a period of time, usually around 12 months, and showing for each example of that event occurring that the process was followed, meaning there's a ticket there, there's an approval. If it's a change that was detected, that change was authorized. The entire goal of the entire security program is to make sure that all access is authorized and all changes are authorized. And the best way to determine that is to be able to say, well, I know every time anyone has accessed anything. I know every time any change is made. And when I say anytime, I mean most times. So that way I can get a lot of assurance that all the changes that were made were authorized. All the access that was granted and activity is authorized. So how do SOCs aggregate evidence? Well, alerts and tickets are evidence that a control is being performed and monitored. So control not only needs to be performed, but most security standards require that you monitor the performance of that control so that year over year, you're able to improve it. So it's not enough for you to just implement a SIEM. You should be looking at your reports, and over time, there should be an improvement of your response to incidents, your ability to detect incidents. Your incidents can go up or down depending on the environment, because you can, depending on what industry you're in, everything is going up. So the amount of attacks that are going to occur are going to keep going up. But how good are you at responding to them? How good are you at applying those lessons learned to new rules? How good are you at using external sources to create rules before that new type of attack happens to you? Alerts and tickets are evidence that you are actually performing these controls. And like we said, most systems can be configured to log when these control activities are occurred. So think about any control activity. Backups have to be performed. Well, your backup system can generate a log and generate an alert every time the backup succeeds or the backup fails. So that doesn't mean that you need to get a ticket or an alarm every time something happens, but you do have a record of it happening. So as long as you can gather that evidence, then you know that let's say your backup control says that your backups must be backed up incrementally on a daily basis. Well, if you are getting that log every day, you can just pull that up in the SIEM, show not only was it being done every day, but our team is monitoring this 24 hours a day, and they get alerts when backups fail so that we can respond accordingly. So you have the control working, and the monitoring the performance of that control is also working. With effective SIEM configuration, evidence collection can be monitored. So you can make sure throughout the year that you are gathering all this evidence instead of waiting until the end of the year when the auditor comes on site and they say, all right, how many employees were hired? How many changes did you make to your organization? Were there any security incidents, and how did you respond to them? You're gathering that evidence throughout the year, so you're ready for those questions when the auditor comes on site. And the goal of this is not to, like going back to the example for backups, the goal of this is not to make sure the backups run successfully every day, and if not, you fail. That's not the goal of a security program. The goal is understanding that things are going to fail. There are going to be issues. How quickly you respond to it determines whether that's a small issue or something that puts you out of business. So the goal of this is to make sure that if these controls do fail, we can quickly respond to it and fix it. So here's an example. So next, what I want to do is go through a couple of controls from an auditor's perspective to show you how an auditor tests controls without SIEM evidence and with SIEM evidence, and how much harder it is to prove that you are performing some of these control activities without a SIEM in place. So CMMC control 3.1.12, I think that's actually the NIST 800-171 control, but it is in the CMMC. It is in the CMMC framework, is that you have to monitor control remote access sessions. So if you don't have a SIEM and you just have a standard network and VPN and personnel access the VPN to access your network, the auditors will come in there, they'll interview your IT personnel and say, how is this configured? How do you onboard personnel? Here's the list of personnel that have access, or should they all have access? Requesting a network diagram to make sure that there's not alternate routes to get into the network that can bypass your monitoring, and making sure that it's all going through an encrypted and secure path. And then request evidence that IT administrators are reviewing VPN traffic log for unauthorized activities. So maybe they have alerts configured on the VPN itself that let them know someone's logged in or something, or someone's attempting to log in multiple times. But again, that would only give you visibility into what's happening on the VPN itself. It wouldn't give you ability to see what that user is doing once they get into the system. So this is the big limitation of trying to do these controls and trying to have them in place without a SIEM, because now you have to go, if there's an incident, you not only have to go to the VPN and look at those logs, but then you have to determine where that user went after they logged in and try to find out what devices they accessed, did they do anything malicious, and you have to do that manually. So without automated alerting and aggregated logging, it's difficult to prove that you can do this. You can just state that there haven't been any security incidents, but really you can't show that you are doing this effectively on a continuous basis. So that same control with a SIEM in place, logs are forwarded from the VPN and from the devices. So any user that accesses your system remotely, everything is automatically monitored. Now that doesn't on its own protect you from anything, because you still have to be able to alert. You have to know that that activity is bad versus normal. But the ability to do that means that if you have those personnel in place and that SIEM in place, you are monitoring. That control is designed and is operating effectively. I just stated the baseline of activities established. So what is one of the most critical things a SIEM does is when you turn it on and you start gathering those logs for the first 30 days, your SIEM is establishing a baseline of normal activity. You can't really tell what is malicious activity until you know what normal activity looks like. And again, without a SIEM, that really isn't possible. So a SIEM generates a baseline of activity by monitoring users and determining what they normally do throughout the day. And then the SOC personnel begin to generate rules to alert for unauthorized activity. And then alerts are aggregated in a console and responded to by security analysts. So you have the logs being generated. You can go directly to your SIEM console. You can show the workflow of those tickets. So you show that they are all aggregated in one place. There's personnel accessing them and actively responding to them. And you can see them all the way through to resolution, and that's all in the console. So the evidence that the auditor would request are the device log configurations, because again, the devices have to be configured correctly for the SIEM to work. The similar configurations, making sure that those alerts are being generated and they're being emailed to the correct people. And then example alerts and tickets to show that throughout the year that this process actually was occurring. But this is a much more effective way to show an auditor that you are actually doing this. And it actually is a much more secure way to monitor your activity in your networks and detect an incident. So going through these two compliance exercises really show you that without effective monitoring, without a SIEM, that you can kind of fake compliance by saying you're monitoring them with your IT personnel, but really, how can you do that without a well-established SOC? It is very difficult to do. So a few more control examples. Most time people don't think about, when they think about a SOC, they don't think about access control in terms of compliance. They do think about detecting unauthorized activity, but not being able to prove to auditors that, hey, all the access in this organization is approved, and we are constantly monitoring that. So, but you can use your SIEM to help easily prove that that these controls are in place. So things like employing the principle of least privilege. If you've identified if you've identified your administrators and you've identified where you onboard administrators, your domain controllers, your sensitive systems, you can create an alert that lets the SOC personnel know whenever a new administrator is created, or when an administrator's privileges are changed, or when a standard user's privileges are escalated to administrator. Now, maybe those things could all be happening legitimately. Someone could be onboarded as a new administrator. Somebody, maybe there's an emergency and a standard user needs temporary emergency access. But those could also be examples of malicious activity. Somebody got access into your system, made themselves an administrator, and they're about to do bad things. Again, after turning off the logs, it's going to be one of the main things I'm going to do is try to escalate my privileges to give myself as much power as possible to do as much damage as possible. So having the SIEM log whenever a user is granted these privileges is a first step in being able to show that all access is authorized, because here's everyone who has been granted access over the review period, and they all have access request tickets, they've been approved, etc. Use of non-privileged accounts or roles when accessing non-security functions. Again, we can monitor the use of privileged accounts, so that control can be marked as implemented, because we can show via the SIEM when administrators are performing activity, and we also have that baseline of activity, so we know what throughout day-to-day an administrator is supposed to be doing. So preventing non-privileged users from executing privileged functions and capture the execution of such functions in audit logs. So here the control is specifically calling out when an administrator is doing something, you have to log it. Again, you can do this locally on each device, but that means each device now has its own set of logs that if there is some sort of network-wide incident, you now have to manually correlate those events and try to figure out what happened, and good luck. But with a SIEM in place, you know you're capturing the execution of those functions. Another example of access control is implementing, this is from HIPAA, which is you have to implement hardware, software, or procedural mechanisms that record and examine activity that contain or use protected health information. So this is basically saying that you have to record activity on any system that stores protected health information, which if you're a healthcare organization is going to be on most of your systems. So how do you do that without a SIEM? Again, you'd have to do it manually. A lot of EHR systems do have logging functionality, but again, that's going to be limited to that cloud system. If someone's on your network, if they're accessing data that isn't in that EHR, maybe you have spreadsheets of patient information, you have PDFs, you have invoices, you have all types of things that may not be stored in EHR. You have to make sure that you are monitoring that activity. And to do that without a SIEM is very difficult. To prove that you're doing it with a SIEM is very easy, because then you just go to that list of devices. Here's a list of devices that have PHI in my network. They're all forwarding user activity logs to my SIEM, and we're monitoring that on a continuous basis. Another control example is change management. So to authorize, and this is from SOC 2. So SOC 2 criteria they're written a little bit different than controls, but again, it gives you a requirement of that whenever you are modifying, authorizing, or remove access to basically anything in your system, you are giving consideration to concepts of least privilege and segregation of duties, which means that you are making sure anytime you're giving access to anyone that you aren't giving them excess privileges and giving them the ability to potentially do bad things without detection. Now, again, without a SIEM in place, that means you'd have to be constantly monitoring all of your systems individually to make sure, okay, if someone's got access now to merge code branches in my GitHub instance, I can't allow them access to migrate code to production in my AWS instance. But those two systems aren't connected. So how do I know that someone didn't give themselves extended privileges just so they could merge an unauthorized change into production? Without a SIEM in place, you can't really do that. So I know this was a fire hose of information here in terms of what compliance is, how SIEMs work, and then how SIEMs can help with compliance. And you're probably thinking, okay, maybe you don't have a SIEM in place, maybe you have security personnel, but you haven't really defined or established a formal SOC. And where do you start? Well, you really do need a SIEM to have an effective security operations center. But before you do that, you need executive buy-in. You need to do a risk assessment. You need your leadership to understand that this is an existential threat to the business. Security is everyone's responsibility in this organization, and there needs to be a formal process for responding to security incidents, especially in today's climate, where this is a business now. I mean, ransomware is now a business where organizations have, they have services they offer to criminals, they have marketing teams, they have recruiting, they are in the business of stealing your money. So you are in the business of protecting your data, whether you know it or not, and you need a formal process. Select a control standard. So you don't have to, all the controls that we were talking about, those are all listed in a myriad of security standards, ISO 27001, FedRAMP, CMMC. Depending on the industry you're in, there is a security standard that is already written out for you. It lists all the requirements you need to implement, and that will get you started in implementing a full security program, but obviously specifically Security Operations Center. Use an experienced security analyst. 9 times out of 10, we'll go to an organization, even large organizations, and we'll say, okay, who's your security personnel? And it's always the IT person. IT is not security. Just because somebody knows computers does not mean they know how to implement security mechanisms. So you need to make sure, especially when you're configuring a SIEM, that person is experienced in both the implementation and the monitoring of that. A misconfigured SIEM is worse than not having a SIEM, because then you're spending money on something that isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, and it's giving you a false sense of security, and will probably end up making any incident you face worse because it's not configured correctly. And finally, this must be a part of an overall risk-based security program. The SOC and the SIEM, I would say, is the most important part of any security program, because it is the only part of your security program that will tell you that you are being breached. Every other security control is putting up a preventative barrier to prevent an attack from occurring. But attacks are going to occur. You are going to face some kind of ransomware incident, some kind of breach over the course of your business that will occur. You have to be able to respond to them. So that is the end of our presentation, and we can take questions.
Thank you, Brian. So a few questions that came through from registrants. The first one would be, do you need a SIEM to show compliance?
You might have asked that before for the last slide. You don't need, you can pass audits without a SIEM, some audits. So something like you may be able to get through a SOC 2 Type 1 without a SIEM, and this also it depends on the auditor. More and more, it's getting harder and harder to prove that you are continuously monitoring your systems and you are able to respond to incidents without a SIEM. So I would say you don't need a SIEM, but you need to be able to do what a SIEM can do, which is not really feasible without one.
Thank you for that. The next question is, how long does it take to configure the SIEM to produce compliance-driven reports?
So that depends on the configuration of your network. So if your network and your network devices are already configured to log these security events, excuse me, then generating the reports and the alerts really that's not too big of a lift on top of the standard SOC or the standard SIEM configuration. There will be some customization in terms of reports, but once you do that, then you are automatically generating the evidence you need for compliance and for your security monitoring. So I would say that, we are SIEM specialists. We can configure most SIEMs within 3 to 4 weeks. However, if you're doing it yourself, it could be 4 weeks. If you have someone as experienced as us doing it for you, it could be. I've seen deployments last longer than a year. They can get very difficult. So again, I would implore you to use experts because this can get very difficult and very expensive too. You're going to end up buying an expensive toy that doesn't work and doesn't do what your executive management thought it was going to do without an expert. So I would say 4 weeks with an expert, incalculable without one.
Thanks again, Brian. Now, another question here. Why should an organization use a SIEM in compliance management?
So again, you don't have to use a SIEM. The reason why you want to use a SIEM is because the part about compliance that is always the most difficult is gathering the evidence. You have your policies in place. you have your personnel in place, then you can hand the policies to the auditor. Your personnel can walk through the processes. They can evidence that they're doing things in observation. But once the auditor says, all right, well, I can see on your employee roster that you've hired 12 admins, or you've hired 100 people. I want to see make sure that they were granted access only after after a ticket was approved by their superiors. Well, if you're not logging that onboarding, you can't really show that person was approved prior to onboarding. You can show the ticket, but you can't show when that person got onboarded. Another example is like things like backups, change configuration. You're creating the SIEM already has all that evidence in it. So it's, instead of going around and gathering it individually, going to the SIEM and configuring it so that it generates it automatically will drastically improve and reduce the amount of time it takes to get ready for audits, which may not be that big of a deal if you're just going through a SOC 2, maybe if you're just going through an ISO 27001. But organizations now, especially if you're any organization that's 200, 300 people in any sort of B2B capacity, you're going through multiple audits at this point. You may be going through, you may be at, you may have to comply with CMMC. You may have privacy standards that you have to comply with as well. So you have several audits going on that may not be going on at the same time. So you may not have dedicated compliance personnel that are now gathering different evidence for different standards and different tests throughout the year. And that just becomes a hamster wheel that you're constantly chasing evidence. It's not there. So now you have to, we have to change the process, make sure that evidence is generated. This is while another audit is occurring. Now the findings of that audit have come out, and you're constantly chasing findings and chasing evidence because it's very difficult to gather evidence of an entire security program, 130 or so controls over the course of the year that 15 or 16 personnel may have had their hands in. If you're automatically gathering all that evidence at all times, all activity, you have it all in one spot, and you should be able to generate it pretty easily.
Thank you again for that, Brian. Finally, last question we have: can any SIEM be used for this?
Almost any SIEM can be used for this. So a SIEM is any SIEM that functions properly is going to automatically, it's going to aggregate the logs that you tell it to aggregate. I would recommend you use a SIEM that is at least on the Gartner quadrant, because the other SIEMs may be able to help you with compliance, but there's a very important security aspect of it as well. You need to make sure that the SIEM functions properly and has been vetted by third parties. So I would make sure you're using an industry accepted SIEM. But any SIEM that you forward logs to and collects logs and alerts on them can be used to help with compliance. Yes, but from a security perspective, please make sure you're using an accepted one. There are countless little SIEM organizations out there. Some of them are really good, some of them are not. You can roll the dice if you want. We choose not to. We use SIEMs that are on the Gartner quadrant, such as Alien Vault, Logarithm, QRadar, Splunk. We want to use established ones.
Great. Thanks again, Brian. That's all the questions we have.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks, Robert, for joining, and thanks, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
Take care.